All right, welcome everyone to this video. This is our video covering the moral psychological research from the TED Talks. In fact, you can look at our title, Using Research for Moral Psychology to Develop Rhetorical Frameworks. It's exactly what we want to do. With a potential subtitle, if you want to remember what this really is about, is understanding how progressives and conservatives value things differently. As the videos point out, everybody has this is cross-cultural, so sort of universal human in many ways. 5 different basic areas that many researchers have defined. Hate defines them this way, and Willer, with his colleague Feinberg, defines them this way. But you can see they're essentially parallel, right? And so we've got harm, care, or equality and fairness, same type of thing. These are a bit more political, I might say. These are sort of the political enactments of these basic principles, since Willer is talking about political rhetoric, right, and how to persuade people of the opposite political party or political thought pattern. Harm, care, fairness and reciprocity, and group loyalty, things like nationalism and patriotism, of course, fall under this. Authority and respect. That could be religion, that could be for the nation, it could be for the hierarchy where you work, right? People have different thoughts on this type of thing, depending upon their political nature, their moral nature. And the last one is purity, sanctity. And so just a few things to take away from this. We can turn any of these into a rhetorical framework, and we saw that in the examples from the study. We'll take a look at those in a minute. I asked you in your homework to guess what you thought they were, and I think it's pretty obvious whether or not something is imagining a conservative audience or a progressive liberal audience. Hate also reminded us, though, that liberals score higher in the first 2. This is important. So you can't use these 5 randomly. Rather, if you knew you were going in to talk to a progressive audience, you'd probably emphasize these. Or another way to look at this is that when liberals and progressives write, they emphasize these automatically because it's their value system. It's their second nature or their first nature to emphasize these things. But they do so even when they talk to conservative audiences. And these do not rank as high. These categories do not rank as high and for conservatives. So you shouldn't expect to be highly persuasive. Here are the 3 categories that were ranked much higher by conservatives: in-group loyalty, authority, respect, purity, sanctity. So if I'm going to talk to conservative groups and I know that, regardless of who I am, I might want to think about using rhetoric and rhetorical frameworks, word choice, etc., that involve these examples, that involve these associations, that involve these. Does that make me unethical? No, not as long as I'm trying to do good in the world. So I'm not necessarily manipulating someone, rather I'm opening their ears, hoping that they will work with me. The reasons might be different, or the reasons their ears are initially opened might be different. But in the end, as long as the work I'm doing for the public, for the world is good, it shouldn't be a problem. It's simply under recognizing differences in values. All right, and that's what Willer talks about as well. One thing Haidt points out, the disagreements in a society aren't over care and fairness, but rather about loyalty, authority, purity, how much respect we have to have for these things, how much these things matter, how much is too much or not enough, right? Willer and Feinberg, a few important notes. Basically, we don't argue through other people's moral systems, even though we should. We tend to argue with our own. That's not good. And number 2, the other big takeaway is that when you do present an issue through someone else's moral system, someone of the opposite politic, so to speak, you'll likely change their mind, or you have a better chance of changing their mind, and that's what his study and his talk is all about. Other things to note that are not in the video but are important for our course: it's entirely possible for much writing to avoid these frameworks altogether. We're going to take a look at examples from our course and from the web that don't really use any of these. They could take advantage of them, but they do not. Right, and so this is yet another tool for you to take advantage of. It might be inappropriate sometimes, but there's plenty of places in life where these frameworks will be appropriate, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. I guess to follow that up, you might notice that some of these examples might seem a bit strange, or as I said, inappropriate, if they're on an official website somewhere. So again, maybe this is more for a public or a discourse community or some group that has a very strong value system that is out of power in some way, that is not the provider of power or technical expertise or anything like that, but is rather a group of concerned citizens, and they want their viewpoint to be heard, and they want to reach out to groups unlike themselves. And that's probably who's going to use these strategies the most. But you can always imagine in your future what groups might you be talking to, and what are they going to value? Are they going to be ranking with the first two, or are they going to rank more with the last three if you are in a political situation, right? All right, let's look at the examples from the Willer-Feinberg study. They provide great examples, things that you can use actually for your life form paper, of how to subtly, or maybe not so subtly, at least for the first example, weave in these rhetorical frameworks. Okay, so here's what we saw. I'll let you take a look at this. These are the answers, so to speak, for the homework. The first one, of course, this is the conservative version. This is playing off of the purity, sanctity for the most part. All the yellow stuff is purity, sanctity. Things are unclean, impure, all this type of stuff. This is really going to appeal to conservatives who like purity. So they like purity. They're going to want to support anything that will clean up all this lack of cleanliness throughout here. But notice what it looks like. All of these things relate to purity or sanctity, or in this case, the lack thereof. I put this one in green real quick. Those who are not poor. Again, that taps into conservative morality or political nature, at least in the United States at this moment. But it probably has more to do with hierarchy. This is an argument. This is an argument that can be linked back to authority, respect, and hierarchy. In this case, that well-to-do people who do what they should, won't get sick, won't be unclean, right? And only people who deserve it, people who are, at the bottom of the social hierarchy, social Darwinism, those are the people that get sick, and therefore they don't need health insurance. And so this is pushing back against that, the idea of hierarchy as well, which leans conservative more than progressive. So that's the reason we see this type of thing in there, to show that it can happen to anybody, not just to poor people who deserve it. So it's pushing back against hierarchy, which is where social Darwinism comes from. Here then we see the good examples of what something might look like in a nice progressive argument. This is about equality and fairness, the first category, I believe. And so you can see all of it in here. And there you go. So there's your answers, so to speak, for your homework. If we wanted to look briefly at one other example, let you read this. You can find this online. This is just from Willer's homepage. But this is arguing for rights for gay Americans. And you can see that this one uses the loyalty message. If you want to take a read through that, you can. So this would appeal more, of course, to conservatives, because it's loyalty, which is something they rank highly. And this is the fairness message. And this is probably what you would see most arguments for gay rights arguing through the fairness message, which is why it works well with liberals, but does not work so well with conservatives. They would probably prefer this message, at least according to the research. So one thing I like to do, if had we more time and we were face to face, would have you actually rewrite something for groups. But here's some situations, you might find yourself in the future. And you'd want to think, well, what type of moral psychology frameworks can I use to try to reach these people? So we might think of, what if you were hanging out with a group of ranchers in Montana? Their streams are being polluted, but, generally they're anti-government and conservative. You might want to say, well, what's going to work best here? Fairness and equality. I say, well, they're kind of conservative, but they're worried about the environment. I'm probably going to go with the purity, sanctity for the environment, because they're ranchers. They're not going to be happy about chemicals in the water or pollution, whatever it is. And they're conservative. I'm going to aim for purity, sanctity with this group, and that might work pretty well. As we know from the TED Talk, actually, that did work pretty well to convince conservatives that environmental justice was worthwhile. A veterans group. They were probably thinking patriotism and loyalty, right? In-group loyalty. These type of things will clearly work well. Although it could also be fairness, depending what group you're talking to. If it's say a college group, a younger group, or something like this, that might work well. Conservative church versus moderate to progressive church, right? We can actually think of these. They would all take place inside of the church, but conservative church going to be here, more authority to God. If we're thinking about maybe LGBT ministry or something like this, you could argue for that inside of the church through a fairness, or maybe the harm and care. Anyone can anyone can care for people. And so you could think of it that way too. Equality and fairness, right? Care and protection. These are the type of things that anyone can provide for the church. And those are most important, and these are less important. and therefore, LGBT clergy, for instance, will win the day in a more progressive church, but perhaps less so in a conservative church, where these things will still be the major values. And so these things make life fairly predictable for you going into a situation. Doesn't mean you know everything, doesn't mean you can't be convincing other ways, but that's still a nice way to see things. All right, considering for a moment when this might be appropriate to use, you certainly won't see it used much in official governmental institutional type of rhetoric. Here's the Center for Disease Control. This is about an outbreak linked to pre-cut melon. If we take a look at this, this could be a huge outbreak, not so different than the type of thing we saw here, right? It could use this type of rhetoric to scare people, in this case particularly conservative people, into really paying attention. But it doesn't do any of that. It doesn't use any frameworks. It's all facts about what happened, why it might be bad, eventually that deaths have happened. So this is good technical writing, right? And it tells us that people have been affected, but it doesn't really use any frameworks. And that's typical of any institutional governmental type of stuff. So they tend to ignore these type of frameworks. It would be too much, too extreme to use some of this rhetoric in situations like this. Here's an example from the American Legion, the Road to a Better GI Bill, which is, of course, what you get to pay for college if you serve. You see a little bit of their frameworks used here in the beginning. Give the first couple of paragraphs a read. What I'm seeing as I look through is this opening paragraph kind of triggers more of a conservative moral schema, the loyalty and patriotism schema. They do all of these things, even though it's kind of implied, the loyalty and the patriotism, but they do all of these things. And yet, what do? We throw them out into the world and watch them struggle to succeed. Here now, I'm starting to see a little bit of the progressive equality, fairness, protect them from harm, right? We see the struggle to succeed there. So we get a little bit of both right there. But the interesting thing is, as you read through, you don't really get much more of that. All you get after this, after they've primed some of these moral psychologies, you really just get a history of what happened, a lot more stats and facts and things like this. And so while they start well, there probably isn't enough reiteration, to actually drive home any of these moral psychologies to either side, to say that they're using moral psychology in a successful manner. All right, I thought we'd look at PETA for something else kind of different here. We could expect this is a very progressive group, of course. So I wondered if we would see a lot of harm, care, fairness, reciprocity, these first two categories. We would expect to see that. This is a group that is a public. They're not an institution. They're not connected to the government. They don't have to be neutral. The interesting thing is, if you read their first missions, their opening paragraphs of their mission statement here, they don't really have that in here. They just tell us what they do and where they work. However, if we scroll down here, we can start to see sort of the liberal progressive nature of PETA come through. Compassion in action, that's harm care, right? Help stop animals suffering now, harm care. We're seeing a lot of harm care in here. I took us to the compassion in action, the first one I pointed out, and you'll see right away now that these rhetorical frameworks are starting to appear. And it's not as if these people are looking at Willer's research, of course, and saying, let's try what he's doing. These are things that are rolling out of them naturally. And we start to see all of the care, right, inside of here. So if you give this a quick read, you'll see a few examples of these, of how this works. Secure victories for animals. Well, it's a war, and so they're winning, right, in some way. And so that's harm and care. From the smallest mouse spared a horrific death, right? This is all harm care to a great extent. All right, I went to a different environmental organization today, Greenpeace. I'm sure you've all heard of it. I went to Defending Democracy. It seemed like a great place to find some of these frameworks that are very, very political. Let's take a look. I'll let you read a little bit of this and see if you can identify some of these, what should be liberal values. Again, we would predict harm, care, fairness, reciprocity, care, protection, equality, fairness as part of their liberal arguments, right? It would be interesting if we actually saw some of this stuff in there, which would mean that they are potentially more appealing to conservatives. As I read the first paragraph, I read this last sentence, and I'm starting to see a democracy that works for everyone. That is fairness, right? So we're tying into that moral framework, which is fairly liberal. If we scroll down just a bit more, you'll see some stuff doesn't have any framework, but if we look at these two paragraphs, you'll see a lot of that harm, care, fairness stuff, a lot of marginalized people, gap between rich and poor, unprecedented attack on social justice, racial justice. So this is all fairness. So you can see how these are being used. We're just about out of time, but these are great examples of where they appear in the public sphere, and go ahead and use this rhetoric in your paper as well. Thank you.